A construction worker witnesses a deadly secret that puts his daughter's life in danger. Forced to confront his dark past, he must outsmart the city's most dangerous crime lord before it's too late. But what he discovers will change everything. Diego's mornings followed a precise rhythm, orchestrated by necessity. The metallic clang of tools in the construction yard blended with the hum of cranes and the occasional barked orders from supervisors. His calloused hands moved automatically, fastening bolts and measuring beams. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, a lifeline for him and Sophia, his 10-year-old daughter. She was the reason he endured the relentless grind. By the time Diego returned home each evening, Sophia was waiting, her small face lighting up as he walked through the door. Their modest apartment wasn't much, but her laughter turned it into a sanctuary. Tonight, as they shared dinner, rice and beans with a few slivers of chicken, Diego couldn't help but feel grateful. Life was hard, but it was theirs. The next day began like any other. Diego arrived early at the construction site, securing his helmet as the foreman barked instructions. He worked quickly, his muscles aching but accustomed to the strain. Around midday, the crew dispersed for their lunch break, and Diego found a quiet corner to sit. He sipped his lukewarm coffee from a thermos, gazing at the towering skeletal structure they were building. The site was massive, dotted with half-finished rooms and empty corridors. That was when he saw it, a group of men in tailored suits slipping into a secluded area behind a row of cement mixers. Diego's brow furrowed. They didn't belong here. He watched as they exchanged briefcases and papers, their voices low but tense. It wasn't the kind of transaction that happened in broad daylight, let alone at a construction site. Diego turned away, trying to focus on his meal, but his unease lingered. He didn't know it, but a security camera perched on a nearby pole captured him clearly as he glanced toward the men. They hadn't noticed him, but the camera had. By the time the workday ended, Diego had all but pushed the incident from his mind. Sophia would be waiting, and he needed to pick up some groceries. As he walked home, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and red. The streets were unusually quiet, the faint echo of his footsteps the only sound. That night, as he helped Sophia with her homework, a strange feeling gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of the men in their briefcases. It was none of his business, he told himself. Whatever they were involved in had nothing to do with him. Yet, unease had taken root, casting a shadow over their small apartment. Diego tucked Sophia into bed, her favorite stuffed bear clutched tightly in her arms. She drifted off quickly, her soft breaths filling the room. Standing in the doorway, he watched her sleep, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. Protecting her was all that mattered. Unbeknownst to Diego, the footage of him at the construction site had already made its way to someone who didn't take kindly to witnesses. Marco Santini leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the security footage reflecting off his sharp features. His dark eyes narrowed as he replayed the video. There on the screen, a man in a dusty construction uniform sat quietly, his gaze lingering for a second too long on the exchange. "A nobody," Marco muttered, his voice calm but edged with steel. His consigliere, Antonio, stood silently beside him, hands clasped behind his back. "He saw more than he should have," Antonio said, breaking the silence. "And the cameras caught his face." Marco's lips curled into a thin, humorless smile. "Then make sure he doesn't get the chance to remember it." Diego's day began uneasily. The quiet from the night before still hung in the air, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Sophia, oblivious to her father's discomfort, chatted happily over breakfast, her spoon clinking against her cereal bowl. "Can we go to the park later?" she asked, her wide eyes expectant. "Maybe this weekend, Princessa," Diego replied with a faint smile, tousling her hair. He checked his watch. Time to go. He walked Sophia to school, her small hand clutching his. The streets felt different, eyes everywhere. Every parked car seemed too still, every corner shadowed. Diego tried to shake it off, telling himself he was being paranoid. As he approached the construction site, a white sedan caught his attention. It was parked across the street, the engine running. Inside sat two men in dark suits. Diego glanced over his shoulder, pretending not to notice, but his heartbeat quickened. Hours later, as the workday ended, Diego emerged from the site, his muscles aching. The white sedan was gone, but he couldn't ignore the pit in his stomach. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. He quickened his steps toward home, only to freeze halfway up the stairs to his apartment. Across the street, parked by the curb, was the same sedan. This time, the men were outside, leaning casually against the car as if waiting for someone. One of them lifted his phone to his ear, his gaze locking with Diego's. Panic surged through him. Diego spun on his heel and rushed into the apartment, locking the door behind him. Sofia was at the table, drawing in her notebook. She looked up with a smile. "Papa, go pack your things, Carino," Diego said, his voice steady despite the thunder in his chest. "We're going on an adventure." Sofia's smile faltered, but she nodded, slipping off her chair and hurrying to her room. Diego grabbed a duffel bag, stuffing it with clothes, money, and whatever essentials he could find. From the window, he saw one of the men pacing, glancing toward the building. There was no more time. Diego slung the bag over his shoulder, scooped up Sofia, and slipped out the back door. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. Diego's breaths were heavy as he gripped Sofia's small hand, leading her through narrow back alleys and abandoned lots. The city seemed darker tonight, its streets winding like a maze with no exit. Sofia said nothing, though her wide eyes reflected her confusion and fear. After what felt like hours, Diego stopped in front of a rusted metal door tucked away behind an old workshop. The faint smell of oil and machinery lingered in the air. He knocked 3 times, sharp and deliberate. It took a moment before the locks clicked open. The man who appeared in the doorway was broad-shouldered and graying at the temples. His face was a canvas of deep lines, his gaze both sharp and wary. "Javier." "Well, look who's back from the grave," Javier said, his voice low and gravelly. "Let us in," Diego replied, his tone brooking no argument. Javier stepped aside, and Diego led Sofia inside. The workshop was cluttered with tools, old parts, and faded military crates. The sharp scent of metal mixed with the faint glow of a single overhead bulb. Sofia clung to Diego's side, staring at the shadows stretching across the walls. Javier shut the door and turned, his eyes settling on Sofia. "Didn't think you'd show up with company." Diego knelt to Sofia's level. "Carino, stay here. Don't touch anything, okay?" She nodded, her trust unwavering despite the fear in her gaze. Javier watched the exchange silently before gesturing to a small office in the back. Diego followed, the weight of his past pressing down on him with each step. Inside, Javier leaned against a desk piled with yellowed maps and dusty bottles. "You swore you'd never come back, Diego. Now you're banging on my door with a kid." "I had no choice," Diego said, his voice clipped. "They're after me." Javier let out a humorless chuckle. "Who? Mafia? Cops? Someone always was." Diego glared at him. "Marco Santini's men." The name made Javier's expression shift, his usual indifference replaced by something sharper. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything. I saw something I shouldn't have," Diego replied. "They want me dead, and they'll come for Sofia too." Javier's eyes narrowed. "You mean Marco Santini, the same man who ran your crew into the ground? You're telling me this is coincidence?" "I don't care what it is," Diego snapped. "I need a place to think, a way to stop them." Javier tilted his head, a cruel smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're still the same, Diego, the killer hiding behind the mask of a father." Diego's fists clenched at his sides, but he said nothing. Javier leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "You can lie to her, but you can't lie to yourself. You're going to have to fight, and you know it." Diego looked away, his jaw tight. He hated how true Javier's words were. "Use what you are," Javier continued, "because they won't stop. You're in this war whether you like it or not." Diego pushed off the desk and walked out of the office, the door creaking behind him. Sofia looked up from the crate she had been sitting on, her expression questioning. Diego forced a smile, though he felt like a man staring into a mirror, seeing a monster reflected back. "It's going to be okay, Princessa," he whispered. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The quiet in Javier's workshop felt unnatural, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Diego paced the concrete floor, his ears tuned to the faintest sound outside. Sofia, sitting on a pile of rags near a cluttered workbench, hugged her knees to her chest. "Papa, when can we go home?" Her small voice broke the silence. Diego paused, his heart twisting. "Soon, Carino, I promise." Before he could say more, a metallic clang echoed from the alley outside. Diego froze, every instinct honed from his past roaring to life. His eyes darted to Javier, who straightened from where he'd been oiling an old wrench. "Expecting company?" Javier murmured. Diego didn't answer. He grabbed Sofia, moving her behind a tool cabinet. "Stay here. Don't come out until I say so. Understand?" Sofia nodded, her face pale. Another sound, a boot scuffing against gravel, sent a chill through Diego. He moved toward the door, grabbing a crowbar hanging from a hook. Javier quietly picked up a hammer, his movements deliberate and deadly. The door exploded inward, slamming against the wall. 3 men stormed in, their dark suits incongruent against the grease-stained backdrop. Diego didn't wait. He lunged forward, swinging the crowbar at the first man's arm. Bone cracked, and the man howled, his pistol clattering to the ground. "Take cover!" Javier shouted. The second man rushed Diego, aiming a knife. Diego sidestepped, his military reflexes taking over. He rammed the crowbar into the man's stomach, driving him into a stack of oil drums that crashed loudly to the floor. A gunshot rang out, the bullet sparking off a metal beam. Javier hurled his hammer across the room, hitting the third man squarely in the forehead. He crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. Diego turned back just as the first man, now bloodied and furious, charged at him again. Diego dropped the crowbar and grabbed a heavy wrench from the table. With a grunt, he swung it hard, connecting with the man's temple. The attacker collapsed, unmoving. The workshop fell silent, save for the ragged breaths of Diego and Javier. Tools lay scattered across the floor, oil leaking from dented drums. "Sofia!" Diego called, his voice hoarse. The little girl peered out from behind the cabinet, her wide eyes brimming with tears. She ran to Diego, throwing her arms around him. "It's okay, Princesa. It's over," he whispered, though his own hands trembled. Javier wiped his face with a grease-streaked rag. "They'll keep coming, Diego. You need to leave. Now." Diego nodded, his jaw set. "They won't stop until they find us. I have to keep her safe." He gathered their things, his movements quick and mechanical. The workshop, once a refuge, now felt suffocating. As Diego carried Sofia outside into the night, his mind was already racing. There was no turning back. The city felt like a predator tonight, its streets dark and silent, ready to swallow Diego and Sofia whole. Diego moved quickly through narrow alleys, his arms wrapped protectively around Sofia as she clung to him, her head resting against his shoulder. "Where are we going, Papa?" Her voice broke softly through the night stillness. "To someone who might help us," he replied, though doubt lingered in his mind. Help was a luxury Diego could rarely afford, but he was out of options. An hour later, Diego stopped in front of an aging brick building. Its windows were covered with metal grates, and a dim light flickered from within. Diego shifted Sofia's weight in his arms and knocked. A peephole slid open with a metallic scrape. "Who is it?" a female voice demanded. "Elena Vargas?" Diego asked. The door opened just a crack. The woman standing there had sharp, calculating eyes, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun. A faint smudge of ink stained her fingers, and her blazer looked as though it hadn't been ironed in days. Elena Vargas, reporter, tenacious and relentless, infamous for digging up truths no one else wanted uncovered. "You're Diego Ruiz, aren't you?" she said, her tone more statement than question. Diego nodded. "You know who I am?" She scanned the street behind him before stepping aside. "Get in." Inside, the small apartment was cluttered with stacks of papers, notebooks, and photographs pinned to the walls, each one marked with scribbled notes and circles. Sofia clung tighter to Diego, her eyes darting nervously around the chaotic space. "Your name has been circling for hours," Elena said, moving to clear space on a worn-out couch. "Marco Santini's men are after you. I'm guessing you know why?" Diego sat carefully, his tired arms loosening Sofia, who nestled close beside him. "I saw something. At the construction site. A transaction. I don't know what it was, but they're hunting me like I pulled a gun on their boss." Elena frowned, leaning against a desk covered in newspaper clippings. "Whatever you saw must be important. I've been chasing Marco Santini's operations for months. Money laundering, blackmail, disappearances. He's behind all of it, but nothing sticks. If you have anything that can prove it..." "I didn't come here to give you a story," Diego cut in, his voice firm. "I need help. My daughter needs help." Elena's sharp gaze flickered to Sofia, who stared up at her with tired, wary eyes. A pause hung heavy between them. "You don't trust me," Elena said finally. "Trust isn't something I give lightly," Diego replied, "but I don't have many options. What do you want in return?" Elena crossed her arms. "I want the truth. What you saw could be enough to bring Marco down, and I need that proof." Diego's jaw tightened. The last thing he wanted was to drag Sofia further into this mess, but Elena's apartment felt like the only safe place left. After a moment of silence, he nodded. "Fine, you help us disappear when this is over, and I'll give you whatever you need." Elena extended her hand. "Deal." Diego hesitated, his instincts warning him not to trust anyone, but he was out of time and out of choices. He shook her hand. As Elena began gathering notes and files, Diego leaned back against the couch, watching Sofia finally drift off to sleep. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to exhale, though the tension in his chest refused to leave. He had made a deal. An uneasy alliance with someone who claimed to want justice. Whether it would save them or destroy them remained to be seen. Elena's apartment was eerily silent except for the scratch of her pen and the hum of a desk lamp. Diego sat stiffly in a corner, his eyes never leaving Sofia as she slept curled under an old blanket on the couch. "Tell me everything you saw," Elena said, breaking the quiet. She didn't look up, her pen poised over a notepad. Diego exhaled slowly. There were 3 of them, suits, clean shoes, one handed over a briefcase, the other took documents. It was quick but tense, like both sides didn't trust each other. I didn't see their faces clearly, but I saw Marco. At that name, Elena stopped writing. Her gaze met Diego's, sharper than before. "Marco Santini doesn't attend petty exchanges. If he was there, it's bigger than I thought." Diego rubbed his face, exhaustion settling into his bones. "None of this matters to me. I didn't ask for it. I just want Sofia safe." "You think ignoring the truth will keep her safe?" Elena shot back. "You're in this because of what you know. If you want to stop running, we need to hit Marco where it hurts." Diego's jaw tightened, 1,000 unspoken words behind his stare. "And then what? You'll write your story, and we'll be left with nothing." Elena stood abruptly, crossing the room to pull out a thick folder. She slapped it down on the table. Diego flinched. "Do you know what's in here?" she asked, her voice low. "Reports Marco kept buried. Killings, bribery, cover-ups, and this." She pulled out a faded photograph and tossed it at him. Diego's heart froze. The picture was of his wife, her smile radiant, frozen in time. "Marco ordered the hit on her," Elena said quietly. "Your wife didn't die in a random accident. She was a target." The room tilted slightly as Diego stared at the photograph. The air felt thick, heavy with memories he had tried to bury. He saw her face again, clear as day, the ache in his chest as fresh as it had been years ago. "You're lying," he muttered, though he knew she wasn't. Elena's voice softened. "Diego, this is your chance, not just to protect Sofia, but to make it right. Marco took everything from you. How much more will you let him take?" He slammed his fist on the table, the sound startling them both. "I've spent years running from this, trying to keep her safe." "Then fight," Elena said firmly. "Fight for her." Diego's shoulders sagged as he slumped back into his chair. The truth weighed on him like a chain, binding him to a past he could no longer avoid. He glanced at Sofia, her small figure rising and falling with each breath. "She's all I have left," he whispered. Elena's voice softened. "Then let's make sure she has a future." Diego looked back at the photograph of his wife. His hands trembled, but his decision was made. "No more running," he said. The night air was thick with anticipation, each shadow seeming to stretch and shift as Diego and Elena approached the warehouse. Perched on the outskirts of the city, the old structure loomed like a forgotten giant, its rusted walls whispering secrets. "You're sure about this?" Elena whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. She clutched a small camera in one hand and a flashlight in the other. Diego adjusted the strap of the backpack slung over his shoulder, his voice low but steady. "We need evidence to bring Marco down. This place is their stash for documents and cash. If we hit it, we weaken him." Elena nodded, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed her nerves. "Let's move." They slipped through a side entrance, Diego leading the way. The interior was a cavern of steel shelves, crates stacked in crooked towers, and flickering fluorescent lights. Dust swirled in the air, the silence punctuated only by their cautious footsteps. "Where do we start?" Elena asked. Diego gestured toward a far corner where a small office overlooked the warehouse floor. "Up there. If Marco's men are smart, they'll keep sensitive documents close." They moved quickly but carefully, the creak of metal grating underfoot keeping them on edge. At the office door, Diego pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. He eased it open, revealing a desk littered with folders, maps, and an open briefcase stuffed with cash. Elena whistled under her breath. "Jackpot. Focus on the papers," Diego said, already sifting through documents. "Anything with Marco's name we take." Elena snapped pictures, her camera clicking softly as she documented the evidence. Diego's fingers worked fast, pulling sheets and slipping them into his backpack. Then he froze. A faint noise echoed through the warehouse, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps. "Someone's here," Diego whispered, his voice razor-sharp. Elena's eyes widened. "We need to go." Diego grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the stairs, but a sudden voice boomed through the cavernous space. "Hey, who's there?" The warehouse lit up as floodlights roared to life, casting harsh beams across the steel jungle. Diego cursed under his breath, dragging Elena between towering crates as shadows darted closer. Gunshots cracked through the air, bullets ricocheting off metal shelves. Elena bit back a scream, ducking behind a crate as Diego reached for a rusty pipe lying nearby. "Stay low!" Diego ordered. He moved like a ghost, flanking one of the men. In a blur, Diego struck him in the side of the head, the man crumpling instantly. Another attacker turned, firing wildly, but Diego was faster. He tackled him to the ground, wresting the gun from his grip. "Diego!" Elena shouted. More men were coming. Diego grabbed her arm, pulling her toward an emergency exit. They burst into the night, panting and shaken, but alive. As they ran into the shadows, Diego clutched the backpack tight. Marco wouldn't recover from this. For the first time, Diego was no longer on the defensive. The apartment was dark when Diego and Elena returned, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign of the diner across the street. Diego dropped the backpack on the floor, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Elena bolted the door, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the locks. "That was too close," she muttered, leaning against the wall. Diego said nothing, his gaze fixed on Sofia, who was still asleep on the couch, her small form peaceful amidst the chaos of their lives. He crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We need to keep moving," he said quietly, more to himself than to Elena. Elena slumped into a chair, pulling out the documents they'd stolen. "These files are gold, Diego. Bank transfers, coded communications. This will bury Marco, but we need time to sort it out." Diego shook his head. "Time is the one thing we don't have." A sharp knock at the door froze them both. Diego shot Elena a look and moved quickly, retrieving the gun he'd taken during the warehouse fight. He held it steady as he approached the door. "Who is it?" he called, his voice low. No answer. "Stay here," he whispered to Elena. Diego cracked the door just enough to see outside. The hallway was empty, but something lay on the floor, a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. Frowning, he glanced up and down the corridor before snatching the box and closing the door. "What is that?" Elena asked, standing up. Diego set the box on the table, his stomach twisting. Slowly, he tore the paper away to reveal its contents. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It was Sofia, taken through the window of the apartment. Diego's chest tightened, his blood running cold. Elena gasped, covering her mouth. "They know where you are." Before Diego could respond, the phone on the wall rang. The sound was jarring, unnatural in the silence. Diego picked up the receiver, his hand shaking slightly. "Ruiz," a deep voice said. "Marco, you thought you could take from me and walk away." Diego's grip tightened, his knuckles white. "If you touch her, you brought this on yourself," Marco interrupted, his tone dripping with venom. "Your little girl? She's the price you'll pay for your mistakes." The line went dead. Diego slammed the phone down, rage bubbling beneath the surface. He turned to Elena, his voice calm but lethal. "They've taken her." "What?" Elena's face paled. "How?" "They were waiting, watching." Diego's fists clenched. "I let this happen." "Diego, listen." "No," he snapped, cutting her off. "I need to get her back." Elena hesitated, then stepped closer. "We'll get her back, together. But you can't go in blind. Marco expects you to come running. It's a trap." Diego paced the room, his mind racing. He doesn't understand who he's dealing with. Elena grabbed his arm, forcing him to stop. "You're not a soldier anymore. Don't let him make you act like one." Diego's gaze softened, but his voice was cold steel. "I'll do whatever it takes to save her." Elena nodded reluctantly. "Then we plan. If Marco wants a war, let's give him one." For the first time in years, Diego felt the old fire ignite inside him, the part of himself he had sworn to bury. He grabbed the documents and began spreading them across the table. Marco had made this personal. Now it was time to end it. The unfinished construction site loomed in the dead of night, a skeleton of concrete and steel rising into the darkness. Diego crouched behind a stack of rebar, his eyes fixed on the faint glow of flashlights moving across the second level. The wind howled through the exposed beams, carrying the sounds of distant voices, Marco's men. Beside him, Elena tightened her grip on the small pistol Diego had given her, her knuckles white. "Are you sure about this?" she whispered. "They took Sofia," Diego said flatly, his gaze cold and unyielding. "There's no walking away." Elena nodded, fear flickering in her eyes but overridden by determination. Diego inhaled slowly, forcing the rising tide of his rage into something colder, sharper. "Stick to the plan. Get to the control room. Cut the lights. I'll handle the rest." "And if you don't make it?" Elena asked softly. Diego didn't answer. He moved like a shadow, slipping into the skeletal framework of the building. Every step brought him closer to Sofia, every breath fueled by the image of her face. On the second floor, Marco Santini stood in the center of a half-built room, illuminated by a single industrial light. Sofia sat on the cold concrete beside him, her hands tied, her tear-streaked face half hidden by her disheveled hair. Marco crouched down, his tailored suit an absurd contrast to the grime around him. "Your father is on his way," Marco said softly, his voice smooth but cruel. "You'll see soon enough how little he can protect you." Sofia didn't answer. Her lips trembled, but her eyes glared at him defiantly. A gunshot cracked the silence. Chaos erupted as Marco's men spun toward the noise, shouting orders. Diego struck from the shadows, a flash of movement that sent one man sprawling to the ground. Before the others could react, Diego fired twice, his shots precise and final. "Find him!" someone yelled. Diego moved through the darkness, using the half-finished walls and open beams to his advantage. His footsteps were soundless, his presence invisible until it was too late. He disarmed another man, slamming him into a stack of metal rods with a sickening crash. Meanwhile, Elena crept along the edge of the site, her heart pounding. She reached the control room, a small exposed office hanging off the side of the structure. Inside, she fumbled through a maze of wires and switches, whispering under her breath, "Come on, come on!" The lights cut out. Darkness swallowed the building. Diego paused, his senses on high alert as shouts of confusion rang through the night. Flashlights bobbed wildly, their beams useless against the sprawling shadows. He climbed a broken staircase, his breath steady, his mind singularly focused. Marco's voice cut through the noise. "Ruiz, show yourself or the girl suffers!" Diego stepped into the room, his silhouette framed against the starlit sky. Sofia's head snapped up. "Papa!" "Let her go," Diego said, his voice calm, measured. Marco straightened, holding a knife near Sofia's throat. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Ruiz. Now you've lost everything." Diego's gaze locked onto Sofia, a silent promise passing between them. Then, without warning, he hurled a wrench he'd been holding. It struck Marco's wrist, the blade clattering to the ground as he stumbled back with a curse. Diego charged. The two men collided, fists flying in a brutal clash. Marco was stronger, but Diego fought like a man possessed. He drove his knee into Marco's ribs, then slammed his elbow into the side of his face. Marco swung wildly, landing a blow that sent Diego sprawling onto the concrete floor. Before Marco could strike again, Elena appeared in the doorway, her pistol aimed. "Let her go!" Distracted, Marco turned, giving Diego the opening he needed. With a guttural roar, Diego tackled Marco, pinning him to the ground. His fists hammered down, each blow fueled by years of anger, loss, and love for his daughter. When Marco stopped moving, Diego staggered to his feet, breathing hard. He rushed to Sofia, cutting her bonds and pulling her into his arms. "It's over," he whispered, his voice breaking. Elena stood nearby, her hands shaking as she lowered the pistol. Outside, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. The sun was rising as Diego sat on the steps of the police station, Sofia nestled against his side. Her small fingers clung to his shirt, her breathing soft and steady as she slept. For the first time in days, Diego felt his chest loosen, the crushing weight of fear slowly lifting. Beside him, Elena emerged from the building, clutching a file of documents under her arm. She exhaled sharply, her face pale from exhaustion, but her eyes carried a quiet triumph. "Marco's men are in custody," she said, breaking the silence. "They'll be unearthing his network for months." Diego nodded, his gaze fixed on the streaks of gold spreading across the morning sky. And Marco? Alive, facing a list of charges as long as my arm, Elena replied. She hesitated. You could have killed him. I almost did, Diego admitted, his voice low. But that wouldn't have changed anything. Sofia deserves better than a father who can't let go of his anger. Elena studied him for a moment before sitting down beside him. You did what you had to, Diego. She's safe now. Diego looked at Sofia, brushing her hair gently. That's all that matters. Elena pulled out her camera and set it in her lap. I'll publish everything. Marco's crimes, the evidence we found, the story's already spreading. People need to see the truth. You're brave, Diego said softly. She smiled faintly. So are you. You gave Sofia a future. For a long time, they sat in silence, the city waking up around them. Cars rumbled down the street, and distant voices echoed through the air. It was the sound of life moving forward, something Diego hadn't felt in years. Eventually, Sofia stirred, rubbing her eyes as she looked up at Diego. Papa? I'm here, Princesa, Diego said, smiling down at her. Can we go home now? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Diego hesitated, his mind flickering back to the dark corners they'd been running from. He squeezed her close. Not yet. We'll find a new home, somewhere safe. Sofia nodded, as if his word was all the reassurance she needed. Elena stood, brushing off her jacket. Where will you go? Someplace quiet, Diego said, rising with Sofia in his arms. I don't want to live looking over my shoulder anymore. Elena extended her hand. Good luck, Diego, and thank you for trusting me. Diego shook it, his grip firm. Thank you for believing me. She walked away, disappearing into the bustle of the city. Diego watched her go, then turned his gaze back to Sofia. As they walked toward the distant horizon, Diego felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The ghosts of his past would always linger, but they no longer defined him. For Sofia, and for himself, Diego was ready to start again. The story of Diego teaches us that sometimes we must confront our deepest fears and darkest pasts to protect what we love most. It reminds us that redemption is not about erasing mistakes, but about choosing a better path when it matters most. How far would you go to save the ones you care about? Would you fight against impossible odds, or would you run from a battle that could define your future? If you want to continue your journey of self-discovery and explore more stories that challenge your perspective, click on the video on the screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales that make you think, feel, and question. See you in the next story.